We've been talking all morning with you now about the implications of the president and the first lady testing positive. Doctor, wanted to really get your thoughts around maybe the question that we were asking before the break, which is, do you think that this changes behavior? Because for so very long, as you know, the president has avoided masks and, in fact, made fun of Joe Biden at the debate for wearing masks. I got an email from an investor who said maybe this will have a good there'll be a good implication for the economy as a result.
Yeah, look, I think it's too early to tell what messages consumers are going to take away from this. I think there is a bottom line message here, though, that everyone's vulnerable to this infection. The White House had in place very strict protocols. They were doing a lot of testing to try to keep infection out of the compound. And they created a bubble around the president. They dramatically limited who was in direct contact with the president, and yet he still became vulnerable and infected by coronavirus. And so I think it demonstrates that really we're all at risk of contracting this infection. This is a highly contagious infection, and now there's going to be a lot of questions about who else was in contact with the president over the period of time in which he might have been incubating this, including at the debates on Monday. So I think it does reinforce just how widespread and contagious this infection is. Now, depending on how the president does, and I hope he does well, but if he does do well, and we're all hoping for that outcome, it could also reinforce that for a lot of people, this infection is relatively benign. A lot of people do have a benign course from this infection, so it could cut the other way. So I think it's just too early to tell what message consumers are going to take away from this.
In terms of contact tracing and the circle around the president, how wide do you think that effort is going to need to be? And who do you think it would encompass, given the people who spend time with him inside the Oval Office, inside of Air Force One?
Well, it's going to encompass everyone. I mean, they're going to cast a very wide net. So I think our traditional approach to how we would think about contact tracing in the real world isn't going to apply here. I think that they're going to do much more aggressive contact tracing and probably quarantine a lot of people until they can get a negative result. There's going to be a presumption that people could be infected. Just given what you're dealing with the White House compound, and you want to be able to protect other officials. And there were other senior government leaders in touch with the president over the course of this week. The vice president has been out of town. I believe he hasn't been in contact with the president since Tuesday. He's obviously been tested. And so that's going to be an immediate question as well about making sure the vice president's safe. But I think that they're going to cast a very wide net on the contact tracing. So whatever normal assumptions we make about that, this is going to look much more aggressive.
Meg, I know you've been looking into what drugs and drug makers may be in contact with the White House as a result of this. And I know you've been looking at remdesivir in particular. Would you start a course of a remdesivir or any other kind of drug in advance of symptoms if, in fact, at this moment he would be asymptomatic? And we don't know, of course, because the White House has yet to disclose whether he is asymptomatic or symptomatic.
Yeah, Andrew, I mean, Dr. Gottlieb can probably weigh in on this, given he is an MD, but given the data, I don't think we've seen remdesivir be used as a preventive treatment. However, of course, antiviral drugs are thought to work best the earlier they are given, and even in some cases, have been shown to work preventively. So that's, of course, something that could be considered. Folks I'm talking with this morning also note that, the antibody drugs in development from Regeneron and Eli Lilly, they're also being tested preventively. I mean, we know that he has the virus. He's been diagnosed, so it's not necessarily preventive. But earlier in the course of the disease is when you'd give these things. There's a risk, of course, in using experimental drugs that have not been tested together. Remdesivir does have an emergency use authorization. Antibody drugs have only presented phase 1-2 data, and those data are strong, but we, of course, don't know, whether you'd use those drugs together and what that would look like. And just to note, Andrew, in terms of the breadth of the potential exposure, I was just talking with Dr. Mike Osterholm from the University of Minnesota, a renowned epidemiologist on infectious diseases, and he noted the risk is very wide, that given the timing here and what we know about the incubation period and when people become infectious, it's likely Hope Hicks had been infectious for a few days prior to being diagnosed. It's like likely the president also was. And so, of course, questions then extend to Vice President Biden, family and staff who are at the debate. He suggested much of the West Wing will likely need to be quarantined. So this is something we have never seen before.
Right. Dr. Gottlieb, on that question, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, picking up on that point, I think that there's a possibility they could consider remdesivir in this circumstance. Remdesivir, the indication for that drug has been largely extended to any hospitalized patient, and it's likely to be extended further to people who are at high risk of a bad outcome, who become symptomatic to COVID. You know, it would be a little bit early to introduce the drug in this setting, but we now do have a lot of clinical experience with that drug, so you feel a little bit more confident about its safety profile. We don't know if the president's symptomatic or not. That's a critical piece of information that hasn't been disclosed. I think the White House does need to speak to that fact right now, because that does put the president on a different trajectory if, in fact, he's symptomatic. But certainly if he's symptomatic, I think it's reasonable to consider using that drug, even though it would be an off-label use of that drug relative to the emergency use authorization. As Meg said, antivirals introduced earlier in the course of the disease, there does seem to be a theoretical basis for why it would improve outcomes. With respect to the antibodies, I think the data on those are just too early right now. I suspect they would hold that in reserve, and if the president, God forbid, became more ill, then they might consider that. But you wouldn't want to introduce that right now.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.